Yeah, so tonight we were going to talk about cryptozoology, which I believe is one of the topics you wanted to get into. So, but let's begin. How long have you been in the study of mysterious phenomena?
Quite a long time. Actually, what got me interested was when I was actually about 5 or 6 years old, something like that. I went to Scotland on holiday with my mum and dad, and we spent one day at Loch Ness. And, even though I was like a little kid at the time, my dad told me this story about the Loch Ness monster, or monsters. And, standing on the shore of this huge 22-mile-long body of water, which is about 3 feet deep, even at that age, you sort of recognize the significance of what you're hearing. You kind of equate it, I suppose, with stories like monsters under the bed or in the closet when you're that age. But still, it sort of made me think, wow, there are real life monsters out there.
Yeah, for sure. That had to be a real kind of...
Yeah. And, sort of when you're exposed to it at that age, I think it does have kind of an effect on you. And then when I got a bit older, sort of 10, 11, 12, occasionally I'll go down to the local library and get a book out about Bigfoot or whatever and read that. And when I finished school, I began working on a rock music magazine in England called Zero and did that for a few years. And I still do quite a bit of that sort of writing now. But I kind of got the bug for journalism and writing, but thought, why not try and combine the background in journalism with the interest in the paranormal and unsolved mysteries, and not just write about the subject, but hopefully, go out into the field and investigate these things and try and bring something new to people where they could hopefully, gather new information and new insight and ideas from what I was doing, and so to make it sort of mutually beneficial, if you like. So that's what I've tried to do, pretty much since late teens, early 20s, something like that.
Cool. So now you're what, 29?
How I wish. I'm 46 this year.
Really? I wouldn't have put you there.
It happens to the best of us, Nick. What can we say?
What's that?
I said it happens to the best of us, There's no escaping that.
Well, the only alternative is death, so
that's
true. Going to be 46.
Yeah, hold off on that one for a while. Yeah. All right, well, let's talk about your cryptozoological, research.
Yeah, I guess cryptozoology keeps you young. So.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't know if anybody heard that lightning or thunder that just happened for me, but if something happens to the broadcast, Nick, just hang tough and we'll get back on.
Yeah, we're in Florida here, and it's been pouring down rain and thunderstorms for the last week, so bear with us, folks.
Okay, so Nick, talk to us about your cryptozoological pursuits.
Well, I've done sort of pretty much everything. I mean, one of the most memorable things for me in terms of investigations is the various expeditions I've been on to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabra. And it's kind of weird that, when people talk about the chupacabra or the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot, it's always kind of like, makes it sound like there's just one of them, do you know what I mean? When, in reality, if these creatures exist, there's obviously got to be a substantial amount of them. Now, the chupacabra is this sort of weird creature that's been reported on the island of Puerto Rico for probably now about 17 or 18 years. But if you go back before that, you find that in certain parts of Puerto Rico, back in the 70s and even the 60s, they were talking about sightings of things that became known as devil birds, and one particular area, an area of Puerto Rico called Mocha, there were reports of a creature that became known as the Mocha vampire. And with hindsight, a lot of the reports of these attacks on animals that were occurring back then sound very much like the attacks of the chupacabra in the 90s and the present day. So in other words, I think these creatures, whatever they are, have been around a long, long time. It's just that the name chupacabra has become more sort of ingrained in the last 15 years in popular culture. But in terms of what the chupacabra is or what it looks like, most of the witnesses on Puerto Rico talk about a creature that's sort of almost like slightly smaller than a chimpanzee, but with no fur or hair. These bright, sometimes glowing eyes, sometimes a pair of bat-like wings, like membrane-type wings on its back, and it having this, like, spikes down its head and neck that, like, kind of look like some sort of punk rock mohawk or something like that. So in other words, it looks kind of a weird animal, to say the least. And most of the witnesses have described it as being very, very vicious. A lot of ranchers talked about farm animals being attacked and killed and drained of blood. And actually the term chupacabra is Latin for goat sucker, because most of the animals that were killed initially were goats and they were being drained of blood. So it's sort of like an appropriate name. And it stuck, you know, it became like a pop icon almost, if you like. Now, of course, you know, when you read about articles and sightings in magazines and things like that, it's interesting, but like a lot of these cases, it's only really when you get out there and you start investigating these things, you begin to realise how, not just weird it is, but how very real it is as well. You know, I mean, to sort of find yourself, as I've done on a number of occasions, actually sat opposite veterinarians and police officers telling you how they'd autopsied bodies that had no blood in them, or that they had been out to little villages and towns in Puerto Rico where people were literally boarding up their doors at night for fear of being attacked by these creatures. You begin to realise that, you know, it's not just a bit of fun or an adventure, but something very intriguing, I guess, and ominous is going on. And so what I've always tried to do with all aspects of cryptozoology, particularly with the chupacabra on Puerto Rico, because, you know, it's only on a few occasions I've been fortunate enough to get out there, is just try and do as many on-site investigations as possible, speak to as many eyewitnesses, stake the areas out and things like that. Because I think that's the only way we're going to solve these mysteries, like the chupacabra, is to get out there and sort of bide our time and wait for them or look for them. So that's probably one of the most memorable ones, because it sort of really brought home the fact that, you know, the fear that this creature sort of instilled in people on Puerto Rico.
So, are you in Texas to study? I mean, is that one of the reasons why you're there, is to study chupacabra?
No, not really. Actually, no. My wife's originally from Texas, although she grew up in the Cayman Islands, so we have sort of real international relationship. I'm originally from England.
Right.
She grew up born in Texas, but moved to the Cayman Islands and didn't actually move back to the US until she was an adult. And now we live in Dallas. So, but no, I mean, I like Dallas. It's sort of a cool area. It's got lots of stuff going on. But in terms of weird creatures in Texas, I mean, we have the Texas chupacabra, this weird animal, which is, there's no doubt it's a canine creature. It's not the same as the one that's been reported in Puerto Rico. It's just a name that's been adopted. But it is a very weird animal. They're basically totally hairless canine animals, but there's a lot of genetic mutations and changes going on with them as well. For example, many of the people who've seen these animals and filmed them have been able to show that their front legs, for some reason, are growing shorter than the back legs. So they have this weird kangaroo hopping movement, if you like. Many of them have cataracts, and their top jaw extends far beyond their lower jaw than it would normally. And they're not frightened of people. In fact, the exact opposite. They're extremely vicious around people, which coyotes and wild dogs, or particularly wolves and things like that, despite what people think, will generally run away when people are around. So in other words, these are known animals. They're definitely canine, but something is genetically altering these animals at like a DNA level, and that's what makes it kind of interesting. And East Texas, which surprised me when I first moved over here about 10 years ago, is actually very heavily forested, all down the sort of the border with Louisiana. And there's one area called the Big Thicket, which is a large area of forest land. And there have been numerous reports of Bigfoot there over the course of the last 50 years or so. And even if you go back and check the old newspapers from like 120 years ago, they'll have reports of what back then were termed wild men of the woods. So, in other words, you know, we've got these reports in Texas just like we do in other areas going back a long, long time.
It's interesting. A lot of Bigfoot sightings in East Texas and in that neck of the woods. So, just sticking with the chupacabra story at this point, what's your take on it? You know, I mean, beyond what you've already said, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, every time I've been to Puerto Rico, I've heard several theories, and it's always the same ones over and over again. One is that it's some sort of alien creature. Other people think, this is kind of an interesting one, that it could be some sort of giant prehistoric bat. And if you look back in the fossil records, there actually were bats very much larger than today's bats, you know, like, I mean, huge. Other people have talked about things like genetic experiments, you know, secret military experiments. And And the fourth most popular theory is the idea that it's literally something supernatural, however you would term the supernatural. For example, there are a lot of occult cults on Puerto Rico, and one of the theories is that, someone's been dabbling in the paranormal, and these creatures have literally been conjured up, from where, who knows. But that's actually one of the scenarios. Now, of course, that theory is dependent upon how we define what the paranormal and the supernatural are. Is it something that can be explained by science, or is it something weirder? Now, as far as the genetic experiment theory is concerned, my view on this has always been, and really still is, that I know there's been a lot of advances in medical science, but I don't even think the US government can kind of mutate a cuddly little rhesus monkey into like a killing machine with spikes down its back. I think that's okay for a sci-fi movie late at night or whatever, but I don't honestly think they can do that, at least not yet, but, maybe I'm wrong. So I'm kind of inclined to go more with the idea that it's some sort of unknown animal that possibly has existed on Puerto Rico for whoever knows how long, but that now has started to attract attention. What it is, I wish I could give an answer. People want answers, but I'm always kind of loath to speculate without having those answers, beyond saying I think it's a real flesh and blood animal of some sort.
Well, there's been sightings in Texas, too. Cases in Texas.
Yeah, those are interesting, but, as I mentioned, they're different. There's no doubt with these canine aspects that they're a different animal. What happened, I think, is that because a lot of the Texas reports involved farm animals also being killed by bites to the neck, and ranchers were talking about their animals being drained of blood, I think what happened is that the idea got around, well, this sounds like that animal on Puerto Rico called the chupacabra. So now we've got the Texas chupacabra. But I actually think it's two different things. It's just the attacks, the similarities between the attacks that make people think it's the same animal.
Mm.
Now, the folks that you've kind of done the investigations with down there in Puerto Rico, what's their impression?
On Puerto Rico itself?
Yeah, the folks that you've done some of the investigation, like law enforcement, or some of the folks that are grounded. What do they think?
Yeah, what's interesting is they actually go along with a lot of the witnesses. They're convinced it's a real animal, and a lot of those are convinced by the UFO theory, the idea that he's somehow connected with UFOs. And there's absolutely no doubt that in the period when the sightings of the chupacabra were at the height, which was about 94 to about 97, there actually were a lot of chupacabra encounters, there were a lot of UFO encounters on the island. A lot of people, for example, were reporting seeing these huge black triangular-shaped UFOs literally rising out the ocean off the coast of Puerto Rico late at night and hovering over the El Yunque rainforest, which is interesting enough where a lot of the chupacabra reports have been found. Now, of course, people say, well, why would aliens have something like that in their possession? One of the interesting theories that I heard was that although the creature, looks vicious and it looks like a wild animal, what about the possibility that it could actually be a very intelligent alien animal, and that is actually responsible for flying these UFOs? And I think that's something we kind of forget. I guess it's human nature to think if something looks animalistic and primitive and vicious, then it's got to be relatively stupid. What if these things are actually very, very clever and technologically advanced, but they just look like vicious killing machines?
The thing I've always found kind of interesting, Nick, is what I need to ask you is, do these events, is there any correlation between where the chupacabra is sort of seen and where the Arecibo dish is? And for many years, as you kind of alluded to, Puerto Rico's been kind of a hot spot for UFOs, and a lot of the folks down there have made allegations that the U.S. government has been involved in some sort of some of the stuff going on there.
No, you're right. Puerto Rico's a very interesting place because not only do you have the chupacabra attacks and UFOs, as you rightly point out, you've got the Arecibo Observatory, which is heavily tied in with the whole SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence project. The idea of essentially beaming messages out into space, hoping that somebody's going to be tuning into the right frequency and not jamming to whatever the aliens jam to and listening into the message.
But you'd think that as much as we put out there, somebody might pick it up, and it's not out of curiosity. I mean, I know it's a big universe out there, but I mean, go ahead.
Go on. Okay.
I was just going to say what kind of noise.
Yeah, one of the things I was just going to say, about I don't have any problem with the whole scenario of SETI researchers beaming messages out there. I think there are several things we need to be aware of, though. It's like, for example, today, 100 years ago, we barely had flight. We had balloons, and then the Wright brothers, barely a century ago, flew. And now we're sending rockets and satellites out into space and space probes, etc. But equally, we've developed atomic weapons to the point where, there's been things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we could have developed very quickly, but destroyed ourselves very quickly as well. And that could still happen. There's no given scenario that suggests we're just going to keep developing for years and years. You look at overpopulation, pollution, ill health, terrorism, atomic weaponry. We have everything, not to be pessimistic, but we have a lot of things against us. So in other words, the point I'm getting at is that it's entirely possible, not to be bleak, that most advanced civilizations, particularly if they're pretty warlike and have opposing nations, might go from being fairly primitive to readily advanced, where they have radio waves, but then destroy themselves within like 100 years. So in other words, if that is the case, if we beam messages out there, we've actually got to hope people pick them up when they're sufficiently advanced to have radio as well, but equally where they haven't got to the point where they've blown each other up. And,
and I think you raise a really good point too. And that point is that any advanced spacefaring civilization is probably radio is going to be their last choice of communication. Whether or not they even monitor those frequencies is like questionable to begin with. So and I mean,
I think we're stuck with this angle of a window area where you go from being technologically advanced to potentially becoming extinct. Doesn't necessarily mean it's inevitable. I don't think it is. And on the other hand, it's like if we develop tomorrow a technology that we could get to the nearest star system, like through wormholes and things like that people talk about in seconds, we might just say, screw radio, let's forget about it. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, then you're not listening for the messages. So, again, I think the problem is a lot of the SETI proponents assume there's aliens out there. They're all sitting around their radios waiting to hear and pick the message up like that. It may not be the case, but, the very fact that the Arecibo Observatory is on Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico is sort of a hotbed for a whole range of alien and UFO weirdness, you have to wonder if maybe somebody actually really has answered the message, and they've decided to
or they've come by just out of curiosity. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
But I think you raise a really good point there, Nick, about the fact that, even though the radio waves are traveling, at the speed of light or whatever, close to it, that whole civilization might be dead by the time we receive that radio signal. They may have advanced just long enough to send out some radio signals and then annihilated themselves.
Yeah, and I think, again, not to be pessimistic, but I actually saw a story on the news just a few days ago where it was saying that how the American population had reached, like, its oldest age ever, the average age, it was like women in their 80s, which was a good thing. But they actually then pointed out that today's kids, so many of them are massively overweight and diabetic, that for the next generation, for the first time in American history, the population, the elderly age is actually going to start to drop for the first time in like 200 years of rising. So in other words, it's possible that's another reason why we could take ourselves out without anything to do with atomic weapons. It's just overeating, lack of exercise, and diabetes.
Yeah, and I think
it might be ironic if that killed us off.
Yeah, and I think the best thing to look at is, look, evolution's been an experiment, and the dinosaurs ruled the Earth for 65 million years before they were wiped out, and by whatever. So I mean, evolution's an experiment, because one thing we know for sure: if we go, somebody else will follow in our footsteps.
You're right, and I think there's another important fact. A lot of people think, we're the human race, so we arrogantly think we're the best. But, again, not to be pessimistic, I seriously don't think we're going to make 65 million years. It doesn't mean people won't exist for 65 million years. It's possible in some form they will. But if you ask me, do I think our civilization, as it stands now, will last that long? No. The Egyptians didn't, the Greeks didn't, the Romans didn't. But people did in some fashion. It just means things start over again, and I think that could be what happened. But if that does happen, then of course, and you don't have the technology, then on top of that, you have no way to answer radio signals or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you a question about the chupacabra again. As far as research goes, what are some of the characteristics of a chupacabra attack that seem to be grounded, that seem to be scientifically, they're there. It's not conjecture. That's actually what's happened.
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things, as I said, is that I've been able to speak to people, with credentials and experts in different fields. Now, one of those areas where I've spoken to, I think, 3 people now, is veterinarians. And each of those veterinarians told me how on the bodies of the farm animals that they had autopsied and studied, that there was 2 characteristics that were present in all the animals. One was puncture wounds to the neck and to the jugular vein, and the other one was a massive loss of blood. Now that's, sort of provokes imagery of like a classic vampire type attack. Puncture wounds to the neck and the blood gone, you think of Dracula and, Hollywood movies and things like that. And that's why I think the chupacabra has had such notoriety attached to it. And also I think that, this aspect of getting commentary from the veterinarians who are actually confirming that is an important one. Now, one of the other areas is that relative to civil defense people. What a lot of people don't know, and which I certainly didn't know until the first time I went to Puerto Rico, is that Puerto Rico's civil defense unit actually have personnel who, I won't say full-time, but I would say a good 50 to 60% of their time in the 1990s was solely devoted to going out and investigating chupacabra attacks. And I was able to speak to some of these people who were still serving in the civil defense, and some had retired. And they literally would go to a filing cabinet and pull out these huge files, like 2 or 3 inches thick, showing photographs of farm animals killed, autopsy reports, all confirming the blood drained and the puncture wounds on the neck. Now, one of the other characteristics that didn't surface every time, but it did surface more than enough times for it to be recognized as part of the phenomenon, is that on many of the animals there was a very, very small incision in their torsos, and the liver had been removed. But it wasn't like the creature, like a wild animal. It's just like sliced the torso wide open and just wildly gone crazy and ripped everything out. It was as if the animal that had done the attacking knew where the liver was, made a small incision, and just literally pulled it out with the minimal amount of damage done to the body, which again suggests some sort of intelligence. And of course, the liver is rich in minerals. In my case, if I pull it out, it'd be rich in beer, but for the most part, it's rich in minerals. But so that was kind of an intriguing thing, which again sort of suggests the idea that the chupacabra, whatever they are, they're not dumb creatures. And the fact that they seem to have eluded capture and sort of hunt at night and hide out in the day, again offers an indication that they're very clever, skillful predators, whatever they are.
So what we've got then is we've got puncture wounds to the neck. Mm-hmm. We have blood completely drained and not on the ground, right?
Yes, yeah.
And that, and in some of the cases where you talk about the liver's been removed surgically almost, isn't that pretty reminiscent of cattle mutilation?
I was just going to say the same thing, Doug.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a good question. A number of people do bring that up. The only difference, of course, is in cattle mutilations, we get UFO reports like we do in Puerto Rico. We get strange lights in the sky. We get black helicopter reports in the vicinity as well. What we don't primarily get in the American cattle mute reports is sightings of strange creatures as well, like the chupacabra. And that is the big difference, that although the attacks are very similar and certain organs are targeted and the animals have blood drained without evidence of where it looks like a wild animal's done it, it looks like some sort of surgical or precision maneuver. That is the big difference, that America doesn't seem to have, ranchers talking about these strange creatures, for the most part at least, being in the area at the same time. But I will agree with you, the attacks are very, very similar.
And it is interesting. I mean, something that I suppose for me, the most confusing or, I don't know, difficult part of this to try to explain is why the blood is gone, and, and like with cattle mutilations, there's no evidence of anything even being there. What about with the chupacabra? I mean, is there any kind of footprints or any kind of activity that's ever been gotten?
Yeah, I mean, there have been reports of footprints, and there have been reports, for example, of claw prints on cages and doors where these creatures have reportedly tried to break into pens and stables, that sort of thing. And there have even been attempts to get DNA for analysis. The problem is, of course, that a lot of people, unfortunately, in Puerto Rico are very poor. So, for the most part, your average rancher and farmer isn't that bothered about getting DNA analysis done of a chupacabra. All they want is the attacks to stop, because if their farm animals die, their livelihood goes away and they starve, literally. So, in other words, the people in Puerto Rico, although they're very well conversant with the mystery, they're not that bothered about solving it, because they're just trying to earn a living and stay alive and get food on the table. So in other words, what you have is a situation where those of us who want to get DNA analysis, we're the ones who have to sort of go out and get it. And then, of course, if you're going to self-fund these things, that can be expensive. So that's one of the main reasons why there hasn't been much progression with the whole DNA angle, is that, most of us don't have the financial capability to hire the services of some sort of forensic CSI lab to do this. It's just beyond our means. And so if somebody could do that, we actually could possibly take it to another level, I think.
Well, one of these days when hell freezes over and our 501c3 comes in, which should be any day, by the way, to those listeners. I mean, it literally should be any day. It's been 10 months. And when we can get some grants, that's what we're looking to do, try to fund some of this stuff.
I think evidence and, things like that are the way we're going to prove it. I mean, sighting reports are the meat of the subject. There's nothing better than witness testimony. But when we've got the witness testimony, then we need to take it to the next level. And I think things like DNA analysis, hair analysis, that sort of thing, that's going to push it to that next level of proof.
Here's a question from the chat room from Sharon. Is there evidence that the animal was paralyzed and alive when the liver was removed? That's actually a very good question. I'll tell you for why. I'm not sure if there's evidence of the animals being alive when the liver was removed, but I'll tell you what I did find on several occasions, which is very, very weird, is that there's some evidence that the animals were alive. They're obviously alive when the attacks occurred, but that they may have been rendered into almost like a sleep state. And I know that sounds very, very strange, but, for example, many of the farms on Puerto Rico, when I use the term farm, I use that loosely because, unfortunately, as I said, because it's a very poor location for the most part, people's farms, it's literally like wire mesh fences in their backyard where they've got 9 or 10 goats and maybe, 20 rabbits or 30 chickens in pens and cages. So in other words, when you're in their living room, like I've done at night and interviewing someone, you can hear the animals, the chickens making noises and, all the animals, because they're just 10 feet away. Now, what's interesting is that ranchers have reported going to bed at night and waking up in the morning and finding all their animals dead in the cages, but they weren't woken up in the night by screaming of the animals, which were only like 10 or 15 feet outside their bedroom window. And a number of people have speculated that maybe the chupacabra has a way to, I guess, almost entrance its prey, like a snake would with a rabbit, where it's unable to move, it's just fixed, and then the rabbit strikes. But possibly there's like
although it sounds extreme, something like hypnosis involved almost. Or people have even speculated that the chupacabra can manipulate like sound waves and create like a sound weapon to disable its prey. And I mean, although that sounds extreme, the military is working on acoustic weaponry now, where they can unleash weaponry that affects your nervous system and creates nausea and vomiting by pummeling you with sound waves. And people have suggested that maybe the chupacabra can do that it has a way of creeping up on its prey and then disabling it while it's still alive, rather than having to sort of chase it all around the yard to grab it. And although it sounds crazy and extreme, that is what we're getting. We're not getting reports of animals screaming at the top of their voices and the farmers running out into the yard. It's always the next day. Well, then there's just been complete quiet and in the middle of the night.
Well, that makes sense, and the fact that these animals are paralyzed somehow has also been part of the characteristics of a chupacabra attack, right? And I'm surmising that that's why, because there is no screaming or fighting or anything like that. It's a
weird angle of it.
Yeah, it is. All right, so let's see. A couple of comments in the chat room. Could they be sucking the blood out via the liver? Looks like from the jugular vein there would be spillage. Any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, the only way, you could ever drain blood without causing any mess and whatever through the jugular vein is if you completely, the jaws of the creature just literally and totally covered the area of incision. It's like, I mean, it really is like you see in the movie. If you slash somebody's jugular vein, it pumps out, because it's a major vein. So that would be the only way. Now, the only animal that really derives blood as a food source in a literal sense is the vampire bat. And there actually are vampire bats on Puerto Rico, interestingly enough. That's why some people speculate, could it be a large vampire bat? But for a creature to actually derive sustenance from blood, what a lot of people don't realize is it's not just a matter of drinking it. Their whole digestive system has to be very, very different to that of a normal animal. I mean, a vampire bat's digestive system is completely unique in the sense that in the way it absorbs the blood and takes the nutrients from it. It's not like, drinking a pint of blood and suddenly you don't need to eat for the next 12 hours, if we were to do it. Not like that at all.
Huh.
Now, I'll give you another sort of interesting angle on that. On Puerto Rico, there's a large and very extensive system of cave networks, which, to a large extent, have never really been explored properly. A lot of people have reported seeing the chupacabra in the vicinity of these cave systems, and one of the theories is that because most of the attacks occur at night, the chupacabra comes down into the lowlands and the farms to hunt at night in the little villages, and then goes back to the safety of the huge Yonki rainforest at night, where most of these caves are. Now, I've been in a lot of these caves, and the first thing I was told when I went with a guide on the first occasion in 2004 was that don't look up, because there's a lot of vampire bats on the ceiling, and a lot of them have rabies, and if they look down at you and drop a bit of saliva on you, in your eye or whatever, you're going to have rabies shots like Ozzy Osbourne had to do, with shots in your stomach and whatever, which isn't much fun, I'm sure. And so, in other words, there actually is like a precedent of these large vampire bats in the cave systems in Puerto Rico, which again has led some people to wonder, could there be far more sinister and weird and presumed extinct vampire bats on the island as well? I mean, it's a good enough theory. Whether it actually answers all the questions, I don't think it does, because how does that tie in with the UFO reports? But I think it's worth keeping in mind that there could be things going on in Puerto Rico that could offer some of the answers that we don't really appreciate the full picture of yet.
Here's a question from John in the chat room. Is there the possibility that the farmer was also affected? And this refers to when they don't hear any commotion, they're asleep. Could it be that the family or the people are also affected somehow?
Well, actually, there are two stories. When I went to Puerto Rico for the second time in 2005, we had a guide named Orlando, And Orlando travelled around with us for the entire week. We just sort of hired a van, and we all travelled around in this van. And he told me of two stories where people had literally been confronted by this creature while walking through the woods. They'd almost like bumped into each other. And both of them said how the creature kind of opened its mouth, extended its jaw, and emitted this, like a strange gas, which made them feel nauseous and lightheaded. They didn't pass out or anything like that, but they did feel sort of faint, sort of wobbly kneed, and like they were going to pass out or whatever. And Orlando did wonder, if the chupacabra did have some sort of disabling mechanism that is fine for an animal that, like a small, 10-pound chicken or whatever, or a 30-pound goat or whatever, but for a fully grown person might make them feel bad, but wouldn't be strong enough to knock them out. And that's kind of intriguing.
Well, like the vampire bats, when they bite, their saliva has also some sort of anesthetic.
That's right. It has an anesthetic, and it also has an anticoagulant, which allows the blood to sort of break down, so it's easier to suck it. So in other words, they're sort of built and primed to carry out these attacks. And, you look at, for example, like an electric eel in the water, in the oceans. Electric eel can dispatch an electric shock from quite a distance to disable its prey. So it's not out of the question that the chupacabra could do something similar to disable its own prey. I think it just depends on the weight and the size of the prey to the extent that it's affected. And that's an interesting thing, is that we don't get many attacks, although there are one or two. You don't get many attacks on Puerto Rico where the victim has been like a pig or a cow. In other words, a large animal, where if the chupacabra is knocking these creatures out with some sort of disabling mechanism, it makes sense that a big animal might not be affected as much. So that's why they don't attack cows and pigs. They go for the small ones that are easily going to be overcome, if you like.
So is there any evidence of the blood coagulating around the wounds?
Well, there actually is, yes. If the animals sort of survived the initial attack, and the blood was still pumping a bit, and then it coagulated, and then they died afterwards. But in many of the cases, the amount of blood that was gone was so significant that even in the immediate wound, none was sort of, there was no patches of blood around the wound. It was almost as if it'd been, if you'd almost taken the head off a vacuum cleaner and stuck it right over the hole and sucked it out. It was almost like that effect. And
there's no evidence of any saliva, or you don't know because of the lack of DNA?
Well, that is actually a possibility. The first time I went there with a film with a crew from the Sci-Fi Channel, we were doing a show called Proof Positive. They tried to determine if DNA or saliva was available. They actually got hold of a few chicken feathers from a chicken that had reportedly been attacked. The problem was the feathers were like 5 or 6 years old and degraded. And of course, that's one of the problems, as I mentioned, is that the people, like the ranchers, they don't care about DNA. They care about having chickens to sell for food.
Yeah, and I would imagine that most of them, that just fits in with part of the culture, part of the the whole history of it. And so I would also probably hazard a guess that maybe some of the Puerto Rican folks, the farmers, are superstitious, and they may not report it right away, or they may be inclined not to report it at all.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of superstitions on Puerto Rico about the chupacabra. There is, as I said, the nuts and bolts UFO angle, the nuts and bolts genetic experiment angle. But when you start talking to a lot of the locals who actually believe the supernatural, paranormal theory, then it gets into more ominous areas, if you like, where you actually find people in some of the little isolated villages around the El Yunque rainforest. When the attacks were at the height, they would not leave their front door. They would literally, the kids would be taken in as the sun started to go down. And it was kind of like you would see in these old horror films, Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and people like that.
Yep.
It was like
put a crucifix on the front door and close it.
Exactly. And when you get to that sort of situation, sometimes it's difficult to get people to talk because they perceive it's going to be bad luck or whatever if they say anything. You know, they don't. Those who kind of go along with the UFO angle are happy to talk about it. Those who are more inclined to the supernatural angle, you know, often clam up and just give the bare sort of bones of the encounter or whatever.
Nick, have the veterinarians done any post-mortem on autopsies on any of these critters?
Oh yeah, and I mean it was actually through the autopsies that it was found that in many cases the livers were missing. That's actually how that aspect of the phenomenon came to be known. And I interviewed in 2005 one veterinarian who told me outright that he'd looked at I think 5 or 6 farm animals and the liver was just gone, and the incision was literally above where you would find the liver, and the implication was something had made the hole, and possibly like sort of very elongated fingers or claws had just carefully and slowly gone in, snipped it, and pulled it out, which is sort of again sort of a
to know the anatomy.
Yeah,
to know the anatomy of whatever you're a predator for is really interesting stuff. So, yeah, that obviously it's fond of livers.
Yeah, it likes livers, but livers are rich in nutrients. There's no doubt about that. And if you're going to go for something, the liver is a good one to go for.
So, have you done any Bigfoot expeditions or research in that area?
Yeah, I've done a lot of Bigfoot investigations. Living in Texas, I've done quite a few in the Big Thicket area. Big Thicket is this huge area of forest in East Texas. When I first moved over about 10 years ago, I thought from watching Western movies and cowboy movies that Texas was all sort of plains and prairies and cactus. And I was quite pleasantly surprised to find East Texas is massively heavily wooded for literally hundreds and hundreds of square miles.
Yeah, it's nice country.
Yeah, and the Big Thicket is this large area of forest that sort of runs down the east side of Texas, and it has a lot of weird activity attached to it. There's a road that goes through the Big Thicket forest. It's called Bragg Road, but locally it's known as Ghost Light Road because for about 150 years, or as long as newspapers and people have been publishing stories, there have been sightings of these weird little balls of light flitting through the woods, which are very similar to the so-called and more famous Martha lights of Texas that you might have heard of. They're like anywhere from golf ball size to, I guess, tennis ball size or a little bit bigger, balls of light that almost seem like under intelligent control and fly very, very fast and rapid and do all sorts of maneuvers through the trees. Now, what's interesting is that in the same location where you get these ball of light reports, we get a lot of Bigfoot reports in the Big Thicket. And the reports are sort of broadly similar to what we get from the Pacific Northwest, where most of the Bigfoot sightings occur. The major difference is that the Texas Bigfoot actually seems smaller, or kind of like an offshoot species or something like that to the bigger ones. In the Pacific Northwest, Bigfoot's generally described as like this huge 7-8 foot tall creature, 400, 500, 600 pounds, massive. In Texas, it's more sort of like a 6 foot tall, more live, athletic looking animal. And some people speculate, well, is it like an offshoot, or is it actually a different type of creature in the same way that, we have gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees? Could it be that, incredibly, there might be more than one type of mystery ape in the U.S. and not just one?
Well, that sounds a lot like the Florida swamp ape in terms of build.
Yeah, it's actually that's actually a very good point. The Texas one is extremely similar, to what's being reported in the Everglades, the skunk ape stories and things like that. It's not like this huge lumbering 8 foot, 9 foot tall creature that people talked about in Oregon and Washington State and
maybe it has to do with the demographics of the area too, Nick. Because some of those, and I think that's really a valid point too, because most of your sightings in Northwest, I've heard people, like 8 feet, 9 feet tall, and yet some of those ones that we've talked, or that we've been just talking about, are much smaller in stature, and almost in a different habitat as well, swampy areas.
I think that's a good point. I think one of the things I found is that most apes in the ape family, are very social animals and live in groups. Bigfoot seems more like a solitary creature that, that's obviously they get together to mate, but for the most part they seem a solitary animal. And I suspect that they could be like a migratory animal as well, that they go where the food is, depending upon the seasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, talk about demographics and things like that, depending on how rich or not the wildlife is, the berries, the plants, the trees, etc., that you could actually eat and sustain yourself with, then I think that's dependent on possibly the size and stature of the creatures. I mean, it's interesting that where we see Bigfoot are generally large forested areas that are rich in native wildlife, whether it's deer, rodents, whatever, that an animal could live on. In other words, we don't see many Bigfoot reports in, say, Nevada or Arizona or West Texas, and that would make sense because there would be nothing for them to live on in those locations for the most part. So actually the fact that we see them in forested and swampland areas is actually a good pointer towards the fact that these are real animals. But I think they seem to be more scavengers than hunters, and scavengers than predators. I think they go where the food is and they grab what they can when they can, and you get to 9 foot tall when you've got a good plentiful supply. You kind of say small and scrawny when you've just got to go with what's available. So.
Well, I think the most interesting part about it is that if we can prove that they exist, they've coexisted with us for a long, long time, and they're pretty clever about avoiding us and evading any kind of detection. And that part is what I find very fascinating because I think it's very feasible that a creature of that size, or like we're talking about now, could live in those areas. And the only part where I kind of differentiate from you, Nick, is I think that maybe they're not so much. Maybe they're solitary and they're in smaller family units.
Yeah, I think, all those are valid points. And I think, when you talk about the fact that these creatures have been able to evade us very successfully, almost like 100% successfully, for however many centuries, I think, again, this kind of moves away from this tendency we have, or a lot of people have, to initially think of them as stupid, dumb, semi-intelligent animals because that's how they look, when actually they may be highly developed in terms of their brains, but just in a different way to us. It's possible that they may have an understanding of nature, of sounds. I mean, some people talk about even Bigfoot having senses beyond ours, things like infrasound, where, you can detect things in a fashion that we're just not able to. In the same way that a dog's sense of smell is to such an extent that we just couldn't even begin to imagine it. Maybe Bigfoot has similar skills and senses that, it can tell when we're in the area and just makes its exit. I think that's possible, that it's not just another ape that science hasn't found yet, but it may well have some very weird skills and senses and talents that, we don't understand properly even.
Have you ever encountered one?
I guess the closest I've come, I'm sure you've heard about these sort of things, is stumbling across in areas where Bigfoot's actually been seen, these so-called Bigfoot teepees, where tree branches have been literally wrenched off rather than sawn off and placed into kind of like pyramid formations. We get a lot of these in areas where Bigfoot's been seen. A lot of people kind of take the approach or the theory, could they be sort of territorial markers that these creatures construct? Right. And, for me, I've found a number of these in the woods where Bigfoot has been seen. And when you come across these, you kind of get this sort of eerie feeling that you're being watched and you've actually gone from the hunter to the hunted, if you like.
So let's switch gears for just a moment. I know that you've done UFO investigations and you've also done haunting type stuff, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I have a question for you. I wanted to get your take on this. In your investigations of these various types of phenomena, Have you ever noticed any overlaps or any phenomena that is common to more than one field?
Yeah, I actually have, and this is something that where I sometimes, I won't say get in arguments, but I just have a differing of opinion with many sort of mainstream cryptozoologists and UFO people, in the sense that I think there are definite overlaps. You know, for example, and although some of these reports sound controversial, I've heard this on a number of occasions where people have said they've seen Bigfoot cross the road in front of their car, and as it's done so, the headlights and engine have failed. Now, you know, a regular animal cannot do that. But in UFO reports, we get that sort of thing going on. There have been multiple UFO reports over Loch Ness, and even, bizarrely, a couple of Men in Black reports at Loch Ness. If you look at the Mothman sightings at Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the 1960s that John Keel talks about in his Mothman Prophecies book, there were UFO reports, Men in Black, poltergeist, all sorts of things. So, and in the big thicket, you know, we have Bigfoot and we have these ghost lights. So I actually sometimes wonder, or have actually in many respects come to accept, if you like, that even though I don't understand exactly what's going on, I think many of these phenomena are somehow interlinked and have a common point of origin. You know, whether it is some people believe there are doorways to other realms, dimensions, and all these things are coming through that doorway, you know, that's one way of looking at it, and maybe that would explain why certain phenomena seem to overlap in one area, because, you know, it's almost like a tube station, like the London Underground. You know, they're all offloading at one particular station,
popping out of one reality for another. Yeah. And it always makes you wonder when you hear a case of some guy who sees Bigfoot at his dumpster, you know, and or not too far from a heavily populated area. Yeah. That's an angle that we've kicked around before too.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, you know, you make a very good point there. When somebody sees Bigfoot by his dumpster, it's like the creature suddenly appeared, hung around for a day or two while everybody is running around with guns trying to find it, and then it's suddenly gone. We find that time and time again in these monster reports, that there's like a wave or a flap of reports in one area, and then it's gone. And then it surfaces somewhere else, you know, 2,000 miles away on the other coast or whatever. And normal animals, for the most part, don't behave like that. But all these weird animals, you know, whether it's Mothman, Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Chupacabra, they seem to have this ability to come and go and always avoid capture. They never get hit by cars. You know, one never dies of old age in the woods and somebody stumbles on it. Somebody says they shot it. They were sure they shot it. They were sure the bullets hit it, but they never find the body.
They must bury their dead. They must bury their dead.
You know, it's like,
Nick, I've got a question for you. I know that in medieval times in Europe, there were reports of Bigfoot, the man in the woods, and to my knowledge, and certainly correct me if I'm wrong, you don't seem to hear very many reports out of Europe. Now, I can understand Europe being very heavily populated and stuff, but am I wrong? Are you knowledgeable about accounts of Bigfoot in Europe?
I actually am. I wrote a book about 3 years ago called Man Monkey, which was a study of Bigfoot reports in Britain. And surprisingly enough, there are probably, I would say, going back to probably 1,000 years ago, when they were sort of known as wild men and wood wozers, as they became known, which was an old term meaning wild man of the woods. Probably between about the year 900 to 1,000 to the present day, there are probably somewhere in the region of about 150 reports of such creatures in Britain. Now, the reason I call the book Man Monkey is because one of the most famous ones became known as the Man Monkey. It actually occurred about 15 miles from where I used to live in England, in a large sort of heavily wooded area near a village called Ranton. And the first sighting occurred in 1879 and involved this weird large ape-like creature with glowing eyes jumping out on this guy as he was crossing a bridge with his horse and cart. Now, bridges are often associated with paranormal phenomena. You can find legends all around the world of strange activity going on at bridges, haunted bridges and things like that. And when I was doing the research, it was then that I found, you know, that this wasn't a one-off case, that Britain had numerous reports of people seeing these hairy, wild men in the woods, in the 1920s or the 1850s or the 1760s. Of course, they weren't termed Bigfoot. They were just, nobody knew what they were. But, you can go to China, they have the Yeren, the Himalayas have the Yeti, Australia has the Yowie. Many cultures around the world have tales and legends of hairy wild men, and I think it's an indication that at some points in many of these locations they still existed, and I think in some of the lesser populated areas they still exist, like the Pacific Northwest and the Florida Everglades and places like that. Gather new information and new insight and ideas from what I was doing, and so to make it sort of mutually beneficial, if you like. So that's what I've tried to do, pretty much since late teens, early 20s, something like that.
Cool. So now you're what, 29?
How I wish. I'm 46 this year.
Really? I wouldn't have put you there.
It happens to the best of us, Nick. What can we say?
What's that?
I said it happens to the best of us. There's no escaping that.
Well, the only alternative is death, so
that's
true.
Going to
be 46.
Yeah, hold off on that one for a while. Yeah. All right, well, let's talk about your cryptozoological research.
Yeah, I guess cryptozoology keeps you young. So.
Yeah, there you go.
I don't know if anybody heard that lightning or thunder that just happened for me, but if something happens to the broadcast night, just hang tough and we'll get back on.
Yeah, we're in Florida here, and it's been pouring down rain and thunderstorms for the last week, so bear with us, folks.
Okay, so Nick, talk to us about your cryptozoological pursuits.
Well, I've done sort of pretty much everything. I mean, one of the most memorable things for me in terms of investigations is the various expeditions I've been on to Puerto Rico looking for the chupacabra. And it's kind of weird that, when people talk about the chupacabra or the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot, it's always kind of like, makes it sound like there's just one of them, do you know what I mean? When, in reality, if these creatures exist, there's obviously got to be a substantial amount of them. Now, the chupacabra is this sort of weird creature that's been reported on the island of Puerto Rico for probably now about 17 or 18 years. But if you go back before that, you find that in certain...
Yeah, so... Tonight we were going to talk about cryptozoology, which I believe is one of the topics you wanted to get into. So, but let's begin. How long have you been in the study of mysterious phenomena?
Quite a long time. Actually, what got me interested was when I was actually about 5 or 6 years old, something like that. I went to Scotland on holiday with my mum and dad, and we spent one day at Loch Ness. And even though I was like a little kid at the time, my dad told me this story about the Loch Ness Monster, or monsters, and, standing on the shore of this huge 22-mile-long body of water, which is about 3 feet deep, even at that age, you sort of recognize the significance of what you're hearing. You kind of equate it, I suppose, with stories like monsters under the bed or in the closet when you're that age. But still, it sort of made me think, wow, there are real-life monsters out there.
Yeah, for sure. That had to be a real kind of...
Yeah. And, sort of when you're exposed to it at that age, I think it does have kind of an effect on you. And then when I got a bit older, sort of 10, 11, 12, occasionally I'll go down to the local library and get a book out about Bigfoot or whatever and read that. And when I finished school, I began working on a rock music magazine in England called Zero and did that for a few years. And I still do quite a bit of that sort of writing now. But I kind of got the bug for journalism and writing, but thought, why not try and combine the background in journalism with the interest in the paranormal and unsolved mysteries, and not just write about the subject, but hopefully, go out into the field and investigate these things and try and bring something new to people where they could hopefully, name that's been adopted. But it is a very weird animal. They're basically totally hairless canine animals, but there's a lot of genetic mutations and changes going on with them as well. For example, many of the people who've seen these animals and filmed them have been able to show that their front legs, for some reason, are growing shorter than the back legs. So they have this weird kangaroo hopping movement, if you like. Many of them have cataracts, and their top jaw extends far beyond their lower jaw than it would normally. And they're not frightened of people. In fact, the exact opposite. They're extremely vicious around people, which coyotes and wild dogs, or particularly wolves and things like that, despite what people think, will generally run away when people are around. So in other words, these are known animals. They're definitely canine, but something is genetically altering these animals at like a DNA level, and that's what makes it kind of interesting. And East Texas, which surprised me when I first moved over here about 10 years ago, is actually very heavily forested, all down the sort of the border with Louisiana. And there's one area called the Big Thicket, which is a large area of forest land. And there have been numerous reports of Bigfoot there over the course of the last 50 years or so. And even if you go back and check the old newspapers from like 120 years ago, they're having reports of what back then were termed wild men of the woods. So, in other words, we've got these reports in Texas just like we do in other areas going back a long, long time.
It's interesting. A lot of Bigfoot sightings in East Texas and in that neck of the woods. So, just sticking with the Chupacabra story at this point, what's your take on it? Beyond what you've already said.
Parts of Puerto Rico, back in the 70s and even the 60s, they were talking about sightings of things that became known as devil birds, and one particular area, an area of Puerto Rico called Mocha, there were reports of a creature that became known as the Mocha vampire. And with hindsight, a lot of the reports of these attacks on animals that were occurring back then sound very much like the attacks of the Chupacabra in the 90s and the present day. So in other words, I think these creatures, whatever they are, have been around a long, long time. It's just that the name Chupacabra has become more sort of ingrained in the last 15 years in popular culture. But in terms of what the Chupacabra is or what it looks like, most of the witnesses on Puerto Rico talk about a creature that's sort of almost like slightly smaller than a chimpanzee, but with no fur or hair. These bright, sometimes glowing eyes, sometimes a pair of bat-like wings, like membrane-type wings on its back, and it having this, like, spikes down its head and neck that, like, kind of look like some sort of punk rock mohawk or something like that. So in other words, it looks kind of a weird animal, to say the least. And most of the witnesses have described it as being very, very vicious. A lot of ranchers talked about farm animals being attacked and killed and drained of blood. And actually the term Chupacabra is Latin for goat sucker, because most of the animals that were killed initially were goats and they were being drained of blood. So it's sort of like an appropriate name. And it stuck, it became like a pop icon almost, if you like. Now, of course, when you read about articles and sightings in magazines and things like that, it's interesting, but like a lot of these cases, it's only really when you get out there and you start investigating these things, you begin to realise how, not just weird it is, but how very real it is as well. To sort of find yourself, as I've done on a number of occasions, actually sat opposite veterinarians and police officers telling you how they'd autopsied bodies that had no blood in them, or that they had been out to little villages and towns in Puerto Rico where people were literally boarding up their doors at night for fear of being attacked by these creatures. You begin to realise that, it's not just a bit of fun or an adventure, but something very intriguing, I guess, and ominous is going on. And so what I've always tried to do with all aspects of cryptozoology, particularly with the Chupacabra on Puerto Rico, because, it's only on a few occasions I've been fortunate enough to get out there, is just try and do as many on-site investigations as possible, speak to as many eyewitnesses, stake the areas out and things like that. Because I think that's the only way we're going to solve these mysteries, like the Chupacabra, is to get out there and sort of bide our time and wait for them or look for them. So that's probably one of the most memorable ones, because it sort of really brought home the fact that, the fear that this creature sort of instilled in people on Puerto Rico.
So are you in Texas to study? Is that one of the reasons why you're there, is to study Chupacabra?
No, not really. Actually, no. My wife's originally from Texas, although she grew up in the Cayman Islands, so we have sort of real international relationship. I'm originally from England.
Right.
She grew up born in Texas, but moved to the Cayman Islands and didn't actually move back to the US until she was an adult. And now we live in Dallas. So, but no, I like Dallas. It's sort of a cool area. It's got lots of stuff going on. But in terms of weird creatures in Texas, we have the Texas Chupacabra, this weird animal, which is, there's no doubt it's a canine creature. It's not the same as the one that's been reported in Puerto Rico. It's just